Oh, we're already live. Uh-oh. I could have said all kinds of sorts of things without knowing it. Hot mic, hot mic. All right, well, welcome everybody to the Policy and Finance Committee for September 19th, 2004. I will call this meeting to order. And if you haven't had a chance, take a quick look at the minutes. And if you have had a chance, I would entertain
Move to approve.
I'll second.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, all right. First thing on our, I will have, it's not on the agenda, but I'm just going to do it under other items. I will have I've got a little hand, I'll give it a quick update on our legislative agenda and kind of the new timeline for that. Amanda couldn't be here today. She's obviously in court doing that stuff. And then we also are waiting on some feedback from state groups that we asked some information to. So we have a different timeline and some other stuff. So, but I'll just do that under other items instead of adding it as its own agenda piece. So with that, the next thing on our agenda is a presentation on who doesn't love debt. All right, Josh, let's talk about debt.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we've been having a lot of questions about, does the city have too much debt? Do we not bond enough? Just general questions overall on debt. So today we want to give a presentation on just the GO side, so our general obligation bonds. And we thought today is actually perfect timing since 2 days ago we approved our budget and we actually had a little conversation on shifting our debt service mill, which inherently relates to our overall the bonding conversation. So with that being said, we'll kind of get going up on the screen. So the city overall, it does have $500 million in total debt. Now, that comes from a variety of sources. So that includes our utility debt, which is $373 million, business type debt that our parking fund pays, or our water fund pays, that's GO, which is that $8.3 million. Then our general obligation bond debt, which is the principal amount is $130 million. That's for things like buildings, fire trucks, et cetera. And then temporary financing. Now, that temporary financing, also known as temp notes, that's the hotel, which that typically, unless another funding source is identified, will go into our total principal amount balance for the debt service fund, which is the first row on the screen. And then typically we make those debt payments twice a year, one in February and then one in August. So that's our total debt, but we got to think the property taxes that people paid that go towards debt payments, they don't go towards that $373 million amount. Those amounts are paid by the user rates from the utilities funds. So this is just overall on how the debt service fund works. So recently we rolled back that debt service mill to 9.717. That fund is strictly used to pay bond and interest payments on things we issue general obligation bonds on. So the revenue comes in mainly through property taxes, a little bit through motor vehicle taxes, and a little bit through special assessments. And the expenses, like I said earlier, are the bonded and interest payments, which we'll kind of get into later for that fund. Now, at the end of 2023, that fund had $22 million in revenue, $20 million in bond and interest payments, to where our end of year fund balance was about $15 million. Now, that's 67% of our revenue, and our minimum percentage balance that we'd like to have is 10%. So there's a healthy fund balance in that fund at its current state. And then we wanted to compare against peers because obviously, like, it's ultimately a policy decision on how much the council is willing to bond, not willing to bond, et cetera. So Topeka, at the end of 2023, our current principal amount was $136 million in debt. That is a lot less than our peer cities. And there's a slide later in here adjusting per capita, but that just gives a decent idea on what our debt load is in principal payments. One reason we don't include interest in that amount is different cities have different ratings. So they might have a different interest amount where we can bond at a lower interest rate. They may have to take a higher interest rate, et cetera. So for a strictly apples to apples comparison, it's better to compare off the principal amounts of total debt. So getting into the per capita. So per capita obviously is that principal amount divided by our population. And so against KCK, Lawrence, and Olathe, and Manhattan, we're much lower on the principal amount basis. Wichita is a little lower than us, but not by much. So we do have a less overall principal debt load compared to other cities on a population basis. Now, seeing where we came in the last 10 years, this chart signifies what our total principal balance percentage change was from 2013 to 2023. So in 2013, our principal amount balance has gone down 10% compared to where it was in 2023. So we are bringing that total principal amount balance on from 136 million. That was 10% higher 10 years ago. So that balance is coming down while other cities is going up. Ultimately, it's a decision whether or not to increase or lower that balance by council, but we are bringing that down while other cities are increasing. And that makes a little bit of sense because for a couple of years where we had ARPA money to do debt avoidance, to where we haven't had to issue as much bonds to cover for projects, and we've also cash funded projects with year-end surplus. So that number does kind of make, with the policy decisions made by council, that does make sense to me why that's gone down. Now, we wanted to project the next 5 years based off our CIP. So what our CIP does is we earmark projects out for kind of the purposes of this that are bonded to where we can see if we actually did bond those projects, where our fund balance would look like. And I kind of view this as kind of a worst case scenario. So let's start with the revenue column, or the revenue row. That assumes a 9.717 mill levy rate in that fund for the next 5 years. Now it's ultimately determined by council. Since we lowered it by 2 days ago, we could eventually bump that back up by spitballing here 0.2 per year to eventually restore it. We could keep it at 9.717, et cetera. But that's the revenue amount is just, if we never restored it, that's what the revenue looks like with a 4% property tax growth. Now on the expense side, that number is derived from our CIP. So that accounts for us eventually potentially bonding the full amount of the hotel, and then not pushing any or delaying any projects in our CIP. Obviously, a lot of that CIP is subject to change based off council approval. And a good example of that would be a couple of years ago when Elevation Parkway was in our CIP, and if we were to do these projections, that would have been accounted for as bonding in this projection. However, council decided not to pursue that project, and so basically this list is fluid for 2027 through 2029 based off what's approved in our CIP and what is eventually approved by the governing body in the form of projects. And so the main thing to take away is we are creeping back up to where our principal balance is going to be near where we were at in 2018. Now, some context to that is, like I said earlier, that takes into account bonding the hotel for the full amount, but that's ultimately, if depending on the direction the governing body goes, is we can use another funding source, we could sell it to a private developer, et cetera. And we also have major projects currently scheduled in the form of parking garages and the City Hall project, to where we are eventually going to have to bond a portion of those two projects. So it kind of makes sense while it's going up, but at the same time, the council always has the purview to identify other funding sources to fund those projects, or delay other projects to eventually get that principal balance to come back down. And so with that being said, I know I kind of went through that pretty quickly, but we just kind of wanted to provide an informative presentation on the general obligation bond side. Obviously open to any questions we may have. And then we're hoping to give a revenue bond one at the next meeting. And the reason we thought it's good to differentiate those two is they're funded through different mechanisms, and so we wanted to focus on one at a time.
Well, I got some comments and questions before I do anything. Let me go first.
Go ahead.
All right. So,
I'm still
a couple things. There is a plan to present this eventually to the full council, correct?
We can definitely do that.
And I think that now, whether we want to wait and do that after we've gotten both presentations at once or break them up, I'm good with either one. But I think that'd be good because they're getting the same questions. To that point, I think when we do that, since that's a bigger public meeting than this, I would add, for those folks who don't know the difference between the GO bonds and a revenue bond, like literally the definition of what those differences are and why they're different. I know it sounds silly, but and then I think it's also important to include in part of this presentation what our bond ratings are and how those have held nice and steady, because that's a reassurance too from the people who care about what we're doing and how we're managing that debt. It's always a good illustration to remind people of the healthiness of what we're doing in that payback process. So, Mayor, did you have a...
Thank you, Chair. I thank you for bringing that up as far as the bond rating and how the nexus between the bond rating and our debt. Josh, I don't know if you want to speak to kind of what our financial advisors were chatting to us with regards to, it's good that we're bringing down our overall debt as far as the relation to our bond rating. However, being that we have been more aggressive in cash funding a number of our projects, I think we do need to also continue to keep an eye on the fact that we have a ever-growing inventory of needs. And so, Josh, I don't know if you want to provide any more details to that, but go ahead.
I think right now we have a AA bond rating. That's a AA bond rating, and I think the last ratings call we had very favorable from the rating agency, and I think Kalen Dwyer from Columbia Capital, he presented that and talked about that on our latest ratings call. So we're in a good position. I think the message that came from the rating agencies is a little bit is incorporated on deferred maintenance, so that's just something we'll have to keep an eye out in the future, to where if we have if that backlog grows, that maybe, and rating agencies are very coy with how their adjustments are, so that's just something maybe we need to keep an eye on going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, you see this number, and it is scary. $500,000 in debt is not a fun number regardless. But I also think, as you've given here today, that context is important to folks. You know, it's kind of like when they tell you your mortgage, yeah, it's debt, but it's a good debt, right? As long as you're paying it off. And so some of this in here is that. And I know we'll get that in the next presentation as we look at some of that utilities debt. It's necessary for infrastructure, but there is a payback schedule based on those rates that we did. And so I always try to caveat with, of course, none of us like the debt, period, but it's about putting in context and showing people there is a plan, there is a payoff schedule. We don't have to raise a lot of stuff to get there. And we're working on that. We're being careful because the 2023 number goes up a little. A couple more just quick things. Just to the hotel point, originally when we purchased that, I know we had some money on hand and we were going to pay it with cash. We ended up bonding it in part because the idea is if we get it sold off, we're only paying that $600,000 a year, and then the next person can either take on those payments or pay them off. We can pay them off that way. So that was when people have asked, well, why do we bond it? Because actually, if we sell it to somebody, it'll save us money having just paid the cash outright, and it gives us some flexibility in working with the buyer. Does this number, although I know it comes from, include all of our approved CIP projects through this time period too? Does it factor those in, or at least the ones for the next couple? I mean, how much or how little of the CIP projects are part of this?
So on your screen, the highlighted 2025 through 2029, what's ever currently outlined in our CIP is included in that projection.
Okay.
So it is consummate with our CIP to where, for example, if we bond $1.8 million of traffic signals in 29, that's accounted for there. Now, it's obviously up to the council. If, let's say, we want to take a year off or don't do it, that number would come down because based off. Okay. So it is based off our CIP.
Well, that's good. I think I'd include that too, because I think that's important to show we're not doing this plus saying, but we're not sure where the CIP projects are going to land yet. We're saying, no, this is with all those projects we've already approved. So you might want to put that in there for the presentation for the full council. I think I had one more question, but maybe. Actually, that's good. Okay. Yes, Councilman Miller.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to clarify something you said earlier. You said that if we continue, the sentiment is that if we continue to defer projects in the future, our rating could go down?
Not necessarily defer projects. It's just if, and I maybe had to have Ben speak a little bit on this, but the feeling we got from the rating agencies is infrastructure repairs, if we delay those are costly more in the future. So basically we are exposing ourselves to more risk by not repairing infrastructure.
Correct, because the cost of things will
Would
continue
go
to
up,
go up.
yeah.
So if we, okay, yep, good.
Those bond people just want us to be in debt.
Yeah,
That's all.
yeah.
No. Councilmember Hofer, did you have anything?
Nope, I'm good.
No, I think it's great. I think it's helpful. Like I said, the debt's not great, but at least we're managing it. And I do think that's important to note. And we'll have some decisions to make, obviously, especially with the CIP next year. But I think this is good. And yeah, I do think whether you want to put them together or for the next one or individually, I think the whole council needs to see all this.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, and we'll tailor a lot of, like, all the suggestions you made, we'll
Yeah.
tailor this to fix it up a little bit to make
Yeah.
it a little more clear on some
Because I
stuff.
try to
So-
keep in mind too, it's not just us we're talking to. It's the people out there also who
Yep.
are trying to understand half of that, which we're trying to understand as we walk through it also. So, all right, anything else for Josh before we tell him he's?
I do have a question.
Yep, Councilmember Hover.
Since they just lowered the interest rate or the debt rate, whatever you want to call it, if it goes down more, is that going to affect these numbers?
Yeah, so currently the interest rate we have plugged in here is 4%. And obviously, like, the interest rate in 2029, that's a best guess, right? Like, it's obviously subject to change. So depending on where interest rates fall, those numbers are only as good as today. So we'd have to monitor that. If interest rates goes up, that percentage balance would go down. Now, if we have to, those interest rates go down, let's say 1%, our percentage of revenue compared to what we take in would go up. So it's obviously a fluid situation and something we'll have to monitor.
Okay, so if the Fed drops, the guess is another 0.5 point this year and could be another couple points next year, who knows? That's going to help all of this. Okay,
Yeah.
that's good to know.
And we bond in August, so whatever the conversations are around that time would be what we're probably going to be locked in at. So
Is all of our debt a fixed rate? Okay, yeah, we don't have anything that's a variable, right? I mean, that wouldn't make sense, but okay. Sometimes if you don't ask. Okay. Okay.
Keep it that way.
All right. Anything else? Anything you want to? Great. Thank you very much, Josh. All right. Now I think it's Rhiannon and Quinn's turn as we will move to item 4, which is the Affordable Housing Trust Fund discussion. I think you guys should have a handout that's not in your book, but that they handed to us. Yeah. Perfect.
Nope,
Yep.
we've got them. Cool. Yep, everybody got this? Great.
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. So this is a little unconventional in the way that we've formatted this. There's lots of details to share and I'm sure lots of questions. So I will start with talking about the proposed revisions to the ordinance and then provide some explanation about how we got there, what we're looking for, and why. So the first change in the ordinance that you'll see is on the ordinance. It reads page 1, but in your packet it's page 17. But it's under section 1, portion C of eligible uses. And what we are proposing is right now the eligible uses are property acquisition, new construction of affordable housing, rehab of existing housing, supportive services, and then also we're proposing a line item be added for consulting services. So, and I will speak more to that here momentarily. Then the second piece is in section 2, which is page 6 of the ordinance. And this is an administrative change. We need to, after some conversations of trying to pull together these several parties that have been called out in the original ordinance, had some conversations with KHRC, Kansas Housing Resource Corporation, and they brought it to our attention that this is generally not something that they participate in at a local level, while they would be happy to look at how their funds can maybe match with ours and help with future projects that, for policy reasons, they would probably not be interested in having a seat on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which I think makes sense. So the recommendation would be to strike them as a written-in seat and then add the number of residents appointed by the mayor and approved by council from 2 members to 3. So those are the changes that we're bringing before you today for thoughts and comments before taking forward. I'm not sure that everybody's had the chance to meet Quinn Cole. I know that she's worked with Councilman Duncan, but if you haven't had the chance, Quinn is our Economic Development Management Analyst in the Planning Department, and she is my saving grace on all things Land Bank and Affordable Housing Trust Fund, because if there's one thing she does really well, it's research, and she's taken a lot of time to put together this document you have in front of you that talks about the information we were able to find on other affordable housing trust funds across the state of Kansas and Missouri, which we found there are very few of. So I think maybe this is just an effort for us to take a step back and give you some baseline information we can talk through and ask for some direction going forward. Quinn, do you want to talk through some of your memo, just kind of run through it briefly and I'll fill in?
Sure. Yeah, so this memo touches on Topeka's current funding model, and then it goes into some of the recommendations and peer models, and then also touches on some federal funding opportunities. So the way Topeka's model works is it's currently funded at $1 million, $250,000 of which came from a donation from the Capital Federal Foundation, and the other $750,000 were funded by the city. And the ordinance doesn't consider any long-term funding solutions, so in order to maintain the funding long-term, we would have to go with some sort of loan or microloan program to maintain the funding. HUD does recommend for local level housing trust funds having a designated funding source. And some examples that they have on their website, but this isn't all of them, are negotiated developer fees, the municipality's general fund, payments from special bylaws or ordinances, so maybe special taxes. And one example that I just found interesting was cell tower lease payments. Some of the peer housing trust funds identified by the Municipal Housing Trust Fund database, which is an advocacy group. Kansas City, Missouri funds theirs with general obligation bonds. Lawrence has a special sales tax designated for theirs, and St. Louis uses sales tax for medical marijuana. And then there is a federal level National Housing Trust Fund that allocates funding to states based on a formula. And the pass-through organization for that is the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation. But their qualified allocation plan designates it specifically to LIHTC projects. Their QAP is not up for comment anymore for 2025, but that could be a potential funding source in the future. And then on the second page, I just show some resources from HUD and other advocacy groups on how to best establish a local level housing trust fund. So that is the information we've covered.
So just to kind of recap on some of that, so this, since there's links in here, we've sent this all to you so you have it via email too, and then both Tanya and Tara have it too so they can send it out and make sure that this document's posted publicly. But I think really after learning all this from Quinn, what I came to was the findings that there's not a lot of, especially Kansas, right? We look at Lawrence and theirs is funded through a sales tax, and we know we don't have that right now. So my hesitancy, I know there's a lot of excitement around the trust fund and bringing the group together. I would be lying if I said I wasn't nervous to form the group and have everybody meet with this idea that we have $1 million without knowing how to make that money sustainable. So that's kind of been a little bit of my concern. The goal is, and hoping that we can take a very minimal amount of funds and locate a consultant that can help us talk through what some options like here could be locally. The housing study that called for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, it was a little casual in saying, well, you have a policy, so you should fund a trust fund, but that's about where it ended. So I think where we're at is just trying to understand how to be the best stewards and certainly keep the program moving forward, but I think some consulting, since there's such a limited amount of cities that are actually doing this right now, would be helpful.
So a couple things I'm going to add. So the first housing trust fund that we passed was 6 years ago. None of us were here then. And when I got on the council, I couple years in, I said, we've got this on the books. Why are we doing nothing with it? I'm one of those who, if you're going to pass it, you use it or you get rid of it, right? So worked really hard to get that first $1 million in there. We did some finagling and thanks to the assistance from Cap Fed. But to Rhiannon's point, that's it. $1 million ain't going to go far. And that's been a big concern. And I know that there are the groups who really want this to move forward, and we're trying, but I think you're seeing why we're being slow rolling this to some degree. And I'll be honest, only in the last year, it's probably the first time we've actually ever truly worked on it. Even though it's been on the books for 6 years, it's only now been maybe a year of actual, like, okay, let's make this thing actually work. So that's why we keep preaching patience, because once we get it up, we want to do it right. And not to Rand's point, have it, ooh, that was great, and then 6 months in, be like, well, I guess it's over. That was fun. We did what we could. This is actually, because it's kind of such an old ordinance, this is what's in front of you is actually the second change we've brought forward. Because again, 6 years go by, the laws changed, we realized we need to update it. Groups who 6 years ago didn't even know they were put in the ordinance, when we went to them to say, we need your appointee, said, well, we really want to be supportive, but who the heck put us in the ordinance? We're like, we don't know, but you're in there, so we'll correct it. So that's part of why this change is here. We actually almost have a full group of people who are ready to serve. With this correction, we'll need to find another citizen, I think 1 or 2 other people, but we actually have almost a full board. I think one of the conversations Quinn and Rand and I have had is, maybe this is a chicken and an egg problem. Do you bring the board together now and say you've got some work you can start doing and let them start working to that degree? Or do you find that funding source? Or maybe, because I've been clear to everybody when I've talked to them who's wanted to serve, this is not a passive board. This isn't one where you're going to get to show up every month, take a few votes and say, good job, city, tell us how to spend the money. That group of people is going to have to be part of this conversation as to where we find long-term funding. That's going to have to be one of their first priorities before they just get to start spending all the money. Well, right, and so I think part of this process that includes maybe bringing someone in to help us find that creative way, because I think some of these ways just aren't feasible. We don't have the money in our general fund right now, right? If we have additional sales taxes, it just can't go to that. So I think there's some creative ways, but sort of doing a hybrid where we bring in that help and then bring that group together so they're part of that, so they understand the responsibility of what that's going to entail, and they can have some input into what those are to get that community buy-in. And they may even have some ideas we've never thought of. So I think that's going to be one of the first things we do. That group might be really disappointed if we do it that way, but they'll get over it, right? They'll understand that before they can just start, because we really, if we spend it first and then try to figure it out, it's going to just die on the vine, and that's not what we want. I also think, and I've said this a few times, I do think the other conversation we've had is we've looked at all the best practices that others, of the models others do, and what they're spending the money on is that this program, at least from our vision and talking with folks, is to really make sure it leads to actual development. Not to be an assistance program in terms of like rental assistance, or we're here to actually create more affordable housing in this community that people can live in at lower rent rates and drive all the rent prices in the community down by having more stock. We live in a society now, I saw a comment on something I was reading the other day that said, there's no such thing anymore as having an overstock of housing. That's what you're striving. You're not striving to get to where you need to be. You're striving for an overstock of housing right now. That's the dream, right? And so this can play an important part of that in helping with gap funding on development and some of those kind of things. So that's kind of the focus. So we got to figure out a funding source, and that's what I tell all the community groups is help us figure that out. I will also tell you, we have people in this community who I think will step up once they're just waiting for us to do it. Because when we went and used to ask for money, they used to say, that's great, but when's it going to start? And we had never worked on it. And so we said, I don't know, just give us the money. Well, I wouldn't just give us money either, right? So I think once we get that piece started too, it's going to, and the board can meet and bring in someone, and it'll show those community groups who said, we're just waiting for you to prove to us it's real before we put money into your housing trust fund. So I do think there's some groups out there who we can access some funding, but I don't think we can rely on them as the primary source, because I will tell you at one point, and I think most of the council may still feel this way, when they put in half of these, or $250,000 of these funds, when the council put them in, they said, we'll put it in, but it's got to be matching. We'll put $250,000 in as long as you can go find another $250,000 to match it, because the council wanted to make sure if they were spending these dollars, the community was truly invested in finding it. And I have a feeling that sentiment hasn't changed too much. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind too, that council's going to be willing, but they're going to want to see that community investment or some outside. So there's all the randomness we've been working on and the thought process of where we're at, so that people kind of understand that it's not just as simple as, we got some cash, let's go spend it. I wish it was. But we are getting there. The good news is, for the first time since this was created 6 years ago, there is actual movement towards getting this thing up and running. So that's kind of a lot of randomness, but questions, comments? Councilmember
I got a
Hofer?
couple questions about the
Sure.
actual $1 million. Is it in the city coffers?
Yes.
Is it earning any interest?
Yes.
So it's actually probably a little bit more than $1 million right now.
Yeah, I would have to verify that, but it should, because we haven't spent any money on it.
Okay, because that, towards your funding source, interest is a funding source. So
No.
that is, because I'd hate to see it just sit there and just be $1 million and be $1 million and be $1 million. And I know there are people out there who really want to go out and spend as much as they can of this right off the bat. So we're going to have to give them some, I don't want to say restrictions, but they can't just go in and spend $500,000 with their first couple of projects.
Yeah.
So there needs to be direction for them on that.
I think to that note, I think that's something that could be really beneficial from developing a relationship with a consultant. One, talking about structure, I think in general, right? I mean, Quinn specifically and myself put a lot of work with Councilman Duncan into structuring the land bank in a way to make sure that we were being good stewards of city property, funds, everything that we had invested into that program. A lot more people have land banks than have affordable housing trust funds, so we were able to kind of borrow ideas and take advice from other peer communities. But this has been a little bit more of a challenge, so it will take some time. And I think a lot of it is work that will have to be done internally too, right? I'm sure that, I can't speak for the interest of all of the folks that are called out here as participants, but I would imagine that their interest is in seeing affordable housing get built in Topeka, not figuring out how the cities got funds and where they come from and what that looks like. So I think some of that work we can do internally. So hopefully we have at least a handful of viable options that we can present to the group. And then let them be a part of the process from there. But we can get some of the low-hanging fruit out of the way. But
Are we going to collaborate with any other groups that are working on doing affordable housing? One I think of is Community Foundation and their project they have in North Topeka, where they provided them, I believe, $300,000 towards the project. So is that...
absolutely, yeah. Marcia Pope is probably tired of answering my phone calls about this group. Yeah, her and United Way. I mean, we're reaching out to all partners, and the great news is that we have great partnerships with all those folks through housing services and some of our, our other programs where we work on rental assistance and some of the things that we think this truly isn't, but just another way that we can partner with those people, so, yeah.
And I also want to make sure that once we get to the point where we're ready to really crank it up and get it going, that when we start reaching out to people to add to it, that we can keep like a minimum in there and keep adding to it and keep growing it. I know private sources is a very hard way to quantify a funding source, but it would be a funding source.
I think a good example of that I could share is our Impact Avenues program through Housing Services. We receive roughly $500,000 every 3 years, I believe, for that program for funding the families that we're able to help, and those are both private donations that come from local partners, one being the Topeka Community Foundation and the other one being Advisors Excel. And I think what really makes that work is that we have a product and we're able to report back our findings and show them the good that it's put into the community. So I think once we get to a place where we're putting out a product and we're actually utilizing the funds and we're seeing the impact and we can turn around and show that, I think that the investors piece will fall into place. I hope.
So do I.
Well, and to your point, Michelle, so in an ideal world, the truth is $1 million is way too low to start a housing trust fund.
Yeah.
The ideal number should have been about $3 million. And I guess this is no secret because I used to yell about it at the big meetings. I couldn't get that money, right? I mean, it took me a year and a half. Every time there was a little extra dollars, I'd make a motion. Can we put 100,000 in the trust fund? Can we put the 50,000 here in the trust fund? And that's kind of how we ended up getting to that million. And then the council said, we're good, $1 million's good. And I get that. I mean, I do. But in an ideal world, 3 million and everything we looked at was a better number because one, it gives you some time to get some stuff done. It lets you build on some projects which can bring some money back in that you can refund the trust fund. It earns you more interest, which you can use as a supplemental to do some matching, whether it's a grant money or donations. So yes, 3 million was the ideal number, but $1 million is what I could drag everybody to at least get that magic million to get us started. So that will absolutely be a challenge and just.
Well, I'd like to see some people put their money where their mouth is that have been pushing us to do this. And I want them to have a stake in it.
And the other thing to your point is we have organizations in town. Community Foundation is one because they're not directly involved in building. I think Marcia, she may end up serving, or somebody from there may actually end up being one of the people on this group. But we did have a few who we went to and who would be great to serve, and what they said was, yeah, but if I'm on it, I can't develop then and be eligible for the money, which they're right. So they said, we'll come to the meetings and we'll provide input and we're happy to participate in the conversation, but we build houses and we're perfect for these. And they're right. They were absolutely right. You're like, yes, you are correct. You can go build these homes. You're already doing it. So they're ready to be involved. They're just not going to serve because they don't want there to be any conflict of interest as we move through it. Councilman Miller, do you have?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. First off, a good report with the trust fund. Good job right there. I honestly, the last part, what you said about St. Louis, I would love for medicinal or recreational help with our fund or our taxes, period. But unless the state pulls their head out on that, I don't think there's much we can do. I am against getting a consultant before the board agrees to it. And I say that because I want to make sure that they have the same amount of buy-in on that, because you're talking about $1 million. That consultant's going to cost no less than 10% of that, I would imagine. You know, I could be wrong, but if we're already losing 10% before we even start to do anything, I would feel kind of I know the public, and I know the organizations that have been heavy on this would not enjoy us doing that. So unless the people who are on the committee agree to that as well, I don't think that's something that we should do ahead of time. I mean, I'm open to the conversation about why you think we should, but that's just my thought. That's my two things.
Yeah, I completely understand that. I am not going to pay a consultant that much. I'm hoping it's far less than 10% of the $1 million, but maybe I'm being naive. There's not a ton of them, so it could just be, I think this was Quinn putting her head down and doing a good amount of research, and this is what we were able to come up with. So maybe it's, we consult ourselves. I think all of this is just to say that we're gonna need some time before we find the right solution. But yeah, I understand.
I do think, last comment I have on this is, I do think as we look at ways to provide funding, we do need to look at them as offsets in other areas of our budget, because there's some resources we're putting towards very minimal, but this kind of thing already. And if the trust fund can sort of take up some of that capacity, with the dollars it has and then the money that goes into it, it frees up those resources that city staff is already engaging in, because, hey, we already got a mechanism now to help go create development in those areas, so we don't have to spend it all over here. So, we think of it as it's not an independent, it's part of the city, and treating it that way as we move forward too, and understanding there's a relationship there. So some of it may be a loss to one area, but it slides over. It's kind of like when I talk about the land bank, when we were doing it, I always told people, I said, on the budget, by the time we're done with that thing over 3 years, you may see technically a loss, right, on the actual budget. But really, realistically, if we've done it right, there's actually a net gain to the revenue that we get in new property taxes and reduction in crime in some areas and all that good stuff. So I think I view this one the same way. All right. Any other thoughts or comments from committee members? Anything else from staff? You
I
don't
guess
need anything from us in terms of a recommendation, right? Or, I mean, a vote, right?
I think my next
I think it's
thought would-
worth going to find out what the consultant would cost
Yeah.
and letting us know, and then we can kind of take it from there and
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah,
digest
we'll,
if it's $5 or $500,000, somewhere in between those two numbers.
is that on the record? No. No, yeah, absolutely. We will do that. Okay, so I'll move that we approve the changes to
Oh, yeah, well, I guess we
the
do need to do that.
resolution.
Yes,
Or
yeah,
ordinance.
thank you. See, I forgot all about that.
It's a good conversation.
Yeah. I will second that. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Yeah, because that piece can move forward without the rest of this, because those changes need to be made.
Wonderful.
Yeah, especially so we can get everyone appointed to the committee. Thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Rhiannon. All right, other items. We'll hand this out really quick. This will not take long. It's sort of a quick update on where we are. I guess I can want to see manager here. So again, we sort of had agreed on three things as it related to taxes. This would be the language we're proposing. You don't have to approve it now or anything. I just wanted to put it in front of you. But one is essentially what we talked about, which was the state needs to take a look at how the valuation system works, because that seems to be needs some modernization, corrections, since it's partially constitutional and it's partially statutes that haven't been updated in decades. The second thing was just asking the state to hold themselves to the same standards as they hold us to, which is things like, if you're going to scream at us to lower the mill levy, then how about you do the same? And if you're going to make us take revenue neutral votes, seems like you should have to do the same also. And then the third one on the tax piece was just the idea, and this, I'll just be honest, this is something that in my day job at the League of Municipalities we're pushing for, as there's more and more and more and more sales tax exemptions allowed by the state, which impact local sales tax. I mean, that closes the gap on sales tax, which makes us more reliant on property tax, which is exactly what we're all trying to get away from, right? To some degree. So the idea is that when they pass sales tax exemptions, it should only apply to the state portion, not the local portion. We also remind them that all local sales tax has been voter approved at some point. So we as a city council cannot just impose a sales tax. Voters have to approve it. And the concept, there is this thing called streamlined compliance, which it's a pact with 20 plus other states, and they're always worried if we get out of it, we get in big trouble, and it involves internet sales. But we have a plan to show them that they can do it. They did it on food. Right now, you don't pay food sales tax at the state level, and that's because they created a rate of 0. They didn't just eliminate it. There's a loophole. God bless good lawyers. So we're working on that. So those were the three we had all kind of said, great, sounds good. The couple that are, I still say under consideration because we wanted to see language, but the first two, I think we're still 50-50 on as a group. We just wanted to see what the language would look like. We've had some follow-up conversations with both the state firefighters and the state police department folks to see their thoughts on it, if they're going to come out against it. There's no reason for us to push it uphill if the whole state groups aren't going to like it anyway. And I will say with the age requirements, anything we've looked at has settled not on allowing 18-year-olds, but more on the concept of, can you enter the academy if you're 20, if by the time you hit the street you're 21, that kind of thing. So you can still, so that'll be the language. It won't be the 18-year-old thing at all. That piece is off the table. It would just be more of, hey, once I'm 21, can I hit the street and be ready? And so that's what we're working on there. So we'll get feedback there. So those, I will say, are still kind of in that 50-50, but we're still looking at the right language. And then the other three, Amanda had discussed two of them. One is strengthening penalties for bad landlords, but there's some limitations on what we can do locally. We got to get some state laws changed. That's clearly is an issue we want to address at some point. And then some kind of incentive program for people who get out of school and say, why would I want to work for city government? We want to be able to say, you do, trust us, and then maybe we can keep them here for a while, right? The last one is a new one. I don't have any details. we will at our next meeting. The plan is at our next meeting to bring all the full language, when you'll get it prior to that meeting, have a full conversation, pass it out, so we can get this on the first meeting in November for the full council for discussion. So it's all kind of passed in November to give Whitney, our lobbyist, time to take it around and talk about it. The MTAA, the Airport Authority, have some issues they would like to see the state change to help directly with some Topeka Airport issues. I don't know what those are yet, but the request of us was to consider them. Amanda's, obviously, again, she's busy. She's going to send those to us to look at and see if it's anything we would just want to support their efforts, since obviously it impacts Topeka to do that. So I don't know what those are yet. And then we took off the list, obviously, the privatization of traffic tickets and the red light cameras. So that's kind of where we're at. That's just a quick overview. But whatever we get, you'll get before the next meeting, all the language, to have a chance to take a look at it. But I want to let everyone know that we haven't dropped it. We just, circumstances, life, that kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to bring up, which is more just a question, not a question, of something for the city manager to look into and staff. So as I've been going around the state doing meetings with other cities, one of the things that has come up was a question as it related, we're talking about EV charging stations. And our conversation started out as whether or not, as we build more EV charging stations and people use them, if they do, there's a loss in gas tax revenue, which obviously we want to make sure that any tax or fees that are applied on EV charging stations go back into the highway fund, because the highway fund cities can access, not the state general fund, which is what, okay. That's not what my question is. During that conversation, it was brought to our attention that maybe EV charging station usage is currently not actually being as part of the equation as it relates to the franchise fees. That usage is not being included in those numbers. And so, and the people who said that know what they're talking about as a general rule. And so they're doing a deep dive too. But I would like for us to see if we can do a deep dive into how we find that out, because we certainly have a number of charging stations in this city, some downtown, some across town. And so if they're supposed to be included in that and they're not, hey, they're new, we'll give everyone the benefit out, but they should be, right? And let's make sure we're capturing that revenue. And if they're not, and there's a loophole somewhere in the law, then let's see what we need to go get fixed to do that. So that's I think that makes sense. Yeah, that was kind of that's what we all said. Really? But
I will tell you, since I was just in Amsterdam, probably about every 3 or 4 blocks, there were at least 2 charging stations. And most of the time, both of them were full. So they have an enormous amount of Teslas in Netherlands, but they have really switched over and they're using a lot more electric. Don't know how it's going to happen here, but
I know
we've got to do something about it.
Electric sales are down. I saw where Ford recently canceled a big electric plant. Having said that, though, the federal government over the next several years is spending $50 billion plus, including some in Kansas, to put more EV charging stations across the state. And I bet some of those will end up in Topeka. So, like I said, I want to make sure we're collecting every little dollar of that wattage that goes through our franchise fee system. So, and if we already are, then I apologize right now, Evergy. I know you're listening somewhere. But if not, let's figure it out. So that's what I had. Anything from the committee?
I just wanted to ask, are we good on ARPA funding? The catch up with everybody?
We are. I mean, if you saw, Josh sent out an audit. We did the random audits, and those all looked good. And we actually did more than like 5. We did almost half of them, I think, or it was a bunch. So that was good. We got a pretty good sample size. So in October, we'll sit down and sort of have what I will call maybe the last big conversation about where we think some things are at. I know there's one account that's still kind of in limbo. I think we've got a plan to save those dollars, so we can talk about that in October. So even if that group's not ready to expend them, I think we can still save them from the feds taking it back and buy them a little more time. So we're working on that. So, but yeah, that'll be on the October agenda for that kind of big conversation. But the audits looked like they went really well, so that's good. Anything else? Anything from staff? All right.
No, Chair, thank you.
Well, with that, let's call it a day. I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.